This Choircast podcast episode is brought to you by the book Letting Go, How I Failed Gay Conversion Therapy and Learned to Love Myself by Aaron Simnowitz. In this book, I take the reader on my journey as I navigate the controversial divide between the evangelical church and homosexuality. This book gives readers just one example of a life that was tortured by gay conversion therapy and how it is possible to come out on the other side of self-acceptance. You can pick up this book at Amazon.com right now.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Catching up with Keith. We're catching up with Keith. Take a look. I bet he wrote another book in the time that it took to sing the silly song called Catching Up with Keith. Boom, 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 boom. Yeah.
No, he's had that song for a while.
Oh. I did write it. It is a theme song I wrote for Keith about 3 episodes ago.
Yes, that's clever. Very clever.
And that, my friends, is the extent of my cleverness. Hey, welcome back to the podcast, everybody. My name is Nat. I am your resident beatnik with the most Nick. You can't even do that one. It doesn't even work, but I'm Nat. I'm with my brother John and Bethany. Say hi, John.
Hi, John.
Say hi, Bethany.
What's up, guys?
See, you won't ever do it.
That was my cool way of doing it. Did you see that? So cool. She is what that woman, I can't remember what the lady who wrote the book called The Disobedient Woman, but Bethany is she's quintessential disobedient woman. Wow. Yes. Wow. That's a compliment. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, you know, I have a friend at work who has a little plaque on her wall in her cubicle that says, "History is rarely made by well-behaved women." And
I like that.
I want to scratch out the rarely and never. Like, well-behaved people in general don't make history. Anyway, we're here today with our good friend Keith, as you might have picked up from my really, really badly written television theme song. But it has become kind of a cool thing, man. We've had Keith on probably more than anybody else. Keith is our good friend. He's our buddy. He's also the guy that we love to hate because he writes prolifically. That joke, it's not a joke. I was serious. Every time I turn around, the guy's cranking out a new book. And to make things worse, they're always really good. I could live with it if you cranked out, shitty book after shitty book after shitty book. I'd be like, well, that's Keith. He writes a lot, but hey, come on. It's not very good. The son of a gun. Each one seems to be better than the one before. And your newest book, which we're here to talk about, The Quantum Sayings of Jesus, is one that has done particularly well. I think shockingly well, as you might have said. It's lived in the number 1 or 2 spot on Amazon for weeks and weeks. And I don't know, maybe we'll just start by asking, why do you think that is? What do you think it is about this particular book that maybe has resonated more with folks than because all your books have done well. I'm not saying
sure.
They haven't.
Yeah.
But this one seems to be a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah. It's hard to know. I mean, I'm just guessing. I think part of it is because I said it was number 1 in its category on Amazon 3 weeks before the release date. So I wasn't even really marketing it. I hadn't done any podcast interviews about it. I had teased it that it was coming, but it was just like number 1. And which usually means, obviously, people are pre-ordering it. And I always sort of like discouraged, like, don't pre-order it. Please wait till the release date. So I think part of that is the subject matter. It's probably a big part of it is that I think people are just interested. I think people are interested in Jesus. We were talking before we hit record, like people don't really like the church so much, but most people, even atheists, like, yeah, Jesus is cool. He's awesome. So I think people are interested in Jesus, and this is a book about Jesus, but not the Bible. You know what I mean? It's not coming from that direction. So I think people are interested in that, just these sayings of Jesus from the Gospel of Thomas. And then there's probably other factors at work too, like the cover. I think it's a really great cover. It's got the word quantum in it. So I worked quantum in there somehow. And that
you
works.
The nerds in there. Like, oh yeah.
So it's a combination. I think it's maybe the perfect storm of things. It's about Jesus, but it's not religious. It's got quantum in it, and it's talking about connection and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, I guess that's it. I think I released it at the right time, and people are interested for whatever reason in this kind of stuff at the moment.
Well, it's also just really good. So it makes sense that people would be into it. I mean, it's so fascinating. It makes you think. I don't know. It like cracks open a door of a very limited amount of Christian knowledge that we have as people based on the Bible. And it says, look, there's more. There can be more than what we've always been handed.
Yeah, I think that's what's exciting about it too. I mean, that's one of the things that drew me to the Gospel of Thomas is that, it's 114 sayings. Half of them are already in the Gospels that we already have in the New Testament, but half of them are new. And there's a whole lot of reason, I talk about this in the book, like there's a whole lot of scholarship and research that has been done. And most scholars do agree that these are legitimate sayings, and there's a reason to think that you could probably date, because it's just a collection of the sayings of Jesus. Really, it's Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said. And that it's just a collection of the sayings of Jesus, and it probably would date somewhere between the writing of the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John. So it's legitimate. It's in this, during the time frame when the Gospels were being written. That's probably about the same time frame these sayings were written down. And so, yeah, I think that's what's intriguing about it. Like, okay, Jesus said these things. Someone wrote these things down. And what do they mean for us today?
Well, and for so long, it was fairly taboo, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this was not something that was spoken. I said spoke about. I used the incorrect past participle, but but not something that was spoken about. In polite company. My first exposure, I'll tell you my little story. My first exposure to the Gospel of Thomas was when I was still a diehard, knucklehead, 20-something evangelical. Mm-hmm. And I got to talk to John Dominic Crossan about this because he was I took a class at University of Maryland. It was like a summer course, and it was a summer course on the historical Jesus.
I'm jealous, man.
Yeah, it was. Well, I wasn't smart enough to realize how good it was.
Oh.
Because I spent most of my summer being offended and pissed off because John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg were the authors of the text that we were using, and
heretics.
They were heretics. Oh, absolutely! They're just a bunch of knuckleheads. They were just a bunch of long-haired, intellectuals.
Yeah.
Talk about that foghorn leghorn. A bunch of long-haired book reading. And they were. He was introducing this the Jesus seminar, which Crossan and Borg were integral in, and they had come up with this book called I think it's just called The Five Gospels is what it was called.
Yeah,
and I was like, whoa, hold up, and really what was funny was about 80% of the class was like me. It was a small class, maybe 20 people in the class, and most of us were like me, and so we were like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. What did I lose count? And so the Five Gospels if you're not aware, it was an attempt to categorize the sayings of Jesus into being either authentic or inauthentic or somewhere in between.
Somewhere in between, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, they used a color code system, and they used a bunch of scholars, and there was a consensus vote. They would kind of go through every single saying of Jesus from the Five Gospels and to say, do we think Jesus, the actual Jesus of Nazareth, actually said this?
Right.
Or did someone later on sort of put this in his mouth? And
and their percentages were pretty small. At the end of it all, they would affirm, positively a very small percentage of the sayings. Then
I think Mark and Thomas scored the highest, and then John was the loser.
Yeah, John was the outlier in all of those, and
it's
obviously
very hard to find. Yes.
Well, you can find a ton of agreement in the Synoptic Gospels, right? Especially if you and you broach this in the book a little bit with the idea of Q, this sort of theoretical, hypothetical document that maybe all the Gospels drew from.
Yeah.
But Thomas was always thrown to me. I'll throw this as a question. So Thomas was always labeled the Gnostic Gospel or a Gnostic Gospel. And to me, Gnosticism is a bit of a ill-defined term. It seems like a nice boogaboo, a little boogeyman for anybody who's like, well, we'll just call it Gnostic, and then we can dismiss it.
Yes.
What is your take on whether Thomas is Gnostic in its origin or in its application, or even if Gnosticism is something that we should be concerned with?
And also, can you define what Gnosticism is for those that might not know?
One.
Yeah. That's boy. Thanks for giving me a lot of homework here. Well, just right off the bat, I'll say no. Thomas is not, the Gospel of Thomas is not only not a Gnostic gospel, it's technically not a gospel. But let me back up and define Gnosticism in a general sense, if I can. This is the reason why I would say, and not just me, many of these scholars I'm talking about, who've studied the text would also say the same thing, that Thomas is not Gnostic. For example, like Dr. Elaine Pagels and, Bart Ehrman and many other people, Candida Moss, people like that, would say that no, Thomas is not a Gnostic text. It's called a Gnostic text typically because it was found alongside other Gnostic texts in the Nag Hammadi. So the discovery of the Nag Hammadi, which was like 30-something writings, which is where we found the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Truth and many other lost texts. So it was bundled in with other texts that were Gnostic. Gnosticism, the reason why I would say, and others say Thomas is not Gnostic, is that Gnosticism is a very complicated, wackadoodle theological system that involves all kinds of crazy ideas like the creator God of this planet and of us isn't the true God. He's actually, some would say, either an evil God or he's just dumb. Like he thinks he's the greatest God, but he's really not, but he doesn't realize that. And Jesus kind of came to show us that the true creator, the true supreme God, created that guy, and that guy didn't even know it. It's like, oh, what? There's someone that made me? Like, I thought I was the main one. But then there's also these layers and levels of like angels and archons and, angelic powers, and they all have different assignments and abilities and all kinds of stuff. And typically that kind of Gnosticism, there's also the idea that there's a secret knowledge, and the sort of the Sethian Gnostics, this is what I'm describing. True Gnosticism is like Sethian Gnosticism. And it also involves this idea that there's this secret knowledge, but if you really look at it, it's always secret. Like there's always another layer and another layer, and like there's never an end to the onion peels, right? It just keeps going and going and going and going. And you will never, ever, 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 ever get the full secret knowledge because there's just another secret beyond that one and another secret beyond that one. It's like endless levels of, some kind of, like secret society or something. So yeah, Gnosticism, that's what Gnosticism primarily is all about. And, Thomas isn't like that. Again, Thomas is just a collection of the sayings of Jesus. Jesus doesn't talk about any of those kinds of things. And as I said, it's not a gospel because it's, most of the gospels, when you talk about a gospel, it's usually a narrative story. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's something about the origin of Jesus, the birth of Jesus. There's something about his life, his interactions with the disciples and the Pharisees, the arrest, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the second coming, apocalyptic warnings. All that. Those are the elements of a gospel. And Thomas, again, has none of those things. He doesn't talk about any of that stuff. It literally is, and you mentioned a Q document, it literally is just a collection of the sayings of Jesus. Like his disciples wrote down the things that he said. And that's kind of what a Q document is. So we think before we ever, had Thomas, because as you mentioned, there were similarities between Mark, but mostly between Matthew and Luke, when they quote Jesus, the theory was, there must have been this other document called a Q document, which would have been a collection of the sayings of Jesus. Because Matthew and Luke don't agree on all the details of the life of Jesus. They kind of contradict each other all the time, almost to the point where one of them is aware of the other one, is like, oh, that guy's got it all wrong. I'm going to on purpose, tell you all these other things that are completely opposite of what the other guy said. But what they agree on is when they quote Jesus. That's the weird thing. So they totally agree when Jesus opens his mouth to say something, the quotes are almost verbatim. But everything else isn't in agreement. So that's why they assume there must be this thing called a Q document. But we didn't have any evidence of that kind of a thing until we discovered the Gospel of Thomas at Nag Hammadi, and we realized, oh my gosh, this text of the Gospel of Thomas is a Q type of document. It's a collection of the sayings of Jesus, which proves that such a document did exist.
And as I'm reading through the sayings as I read through your book, another element of Gnosticism that was always sort of drilled into me was that for the Gnostics, almost sort of a Platonic
idea of this division, this hierarchy of spiritual being transcendent and good, and the physical being right? This is something we have to shed and we transcend. And so Jesus, and I think I've got that reversed for Plato. I don't think Plato, I'm not sure that's the correct order, but it's a similar division, right? Where for the Gnostic, Jesus then takes on a purely spiritual identity. He like the fact that he physically lived, physically died, physically resurrected. Why would God ever inhabit this nasty physical self?
Yeah, that's right. There's a very strong anti sort of physical flesh idea. Right. And there's a bit of that in Thomas, but not to that degree.
Yeah.
Because the Gnostics were so focused on that idea that the flesh is evil and the spirit is good, that to them, Jesus was always a spirit. He never could have ever taken on any flesh whatsoever. So he was never a spirit. He was never flesh. So there was no real incarnation in that sense. There was no physical crucifixion. There was no physical resurrection. It was all spiritual all the time. Thomas doesn't go that far. There is the idea in Thomas that what Jesus says in Thomas is that there's sort of an illusion about reality, what reality is truly about. And so it's not saying that the physical world is evil. It is saying, though, that the physical world that we experience is not the fullness of reality. That there's a truer, deeper, more real reality beyond that one. And that one is about our connection with God and our connection with one another. So the shared divinity and the shared humanity that we have. And so some of the sayings could be taken that way. If you were leaning in a Gnostic direction, you could say, oh, see, the physical part is bad. That's not what he's trying to say. It's more just saying like that, don't stop there. Like, don't act like your separateness from another human being because you have a body and they have a body and all that is, or that you're a physical person and God is a spiritual being, that proves this idea of separation. So Jesus is saying those are illusions. Don't take that physical form as evidence that this is the true reality. The true reality is that you have always been connected to the divine, and your connection to the divinity is also why all humanity is connected to God and to each other.
It's interesting though, because you get that same sense from Paul quite a bit, that this fleshly thing that we inhabit is bad and we have to transcend it. It's almost like this is where maybe the Gospels and maybe Thomas are more in agreement than with even Paul. Because I feel like Paul comes into contradiction a lot of times with at least the way that I read the Gospels. But could you walk us through real quick, and then I'll cede the mic over for a second. But the lens that you talked about when you first started talking, was like, listen, if you just read these collections in isolation, you might come away with like, okay, these are wackadoodle weird things.
They are nonsensical. Yes,
they are nonsensical and right.
Yes,
and or contradictory. But the lens that you applied, I thought as soon as I read that and then I started reading through the things, I'm like, holy shit! Like, okay, that was very, very useful in not reading something into the text that maybe wasn't there. Could you walk us through that? And then I'll
absolutely. Yeah. And I'm very, very grateful to my friend William Duffy because like the very first time I read the Gospel of Thomas, I just thought it was stupid. Someone said, you got to read this. It's so great. And I read about probably the first, 10, 15 sayings. And I just said, this is the dumbest thing I've ever read. It makes no sense. Jesus would never talk this way. It's just nonsensical. And I put it aside. But then I read this book by William Duffy, and I think it's called The Hidden Gospel of Thomas. And he's the one that kind of showed me this lens that I'm talking about. So full credit given, and I give credit in the book. Thank you, William Duffy, for helping me, because I did the same thing. He presented this lens, and he said basically like the reason why people read the Gospel of Thomas and they can make no sense of it, and it just seems to be gobbledygook, is that you have to read it through this lens of non-duality. You have to read it through the lens of oneness and connection. And that if you read the sayings through that lens, it makes total sense. And so I was reading his book. I'm on a plane, I'm reading his book. And, he says that. I'm like, well, yeah, that's right. Because when I read it, it made no sense. And then he suggests this is the lens to use. It's this lens of non-duality and oneness and connection. I'm like, well, okay, that's nice. And then, he gives some examples. I'm like, oh, yeah, you're right. Okay, that makes sense. But I'm still not convinced. I'm kind of like, yeah, but you could just come up with something and say, well, hey, everybody, let's just use this idea. And then when we read it with this thing in the back of our mind, that'll make it make sense. Okay, but that doesn't mean that that's what he really meant. You know what I mean? Like, I still wasn't 100% convinced. And the thing he said that convinced me was he used saying 7. I'm going to read saying 7, and you're going to agree with me. This is the dumbest stuff you've ever heard. Here it is. Jesus said, "Blessed is the lion that becomes man when consumed by man. And cursed is the man whom the lion consumes, and the man becomes a lion." And that's probably the point where I just said, nope, this is dumb, and I put it away. But Duffy says, look, no, again, understand, this is true of everything, right? When you read Jesus in Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, Jesus almost never says something where the elements that he's using in the parable or the story mean only what he's talking about, right? He's talking about lost sons and lost coins and lost sheep and shepherds and, all this kind of stuff. But he doesn't mean that. He means these things represent other things. So obviously in this also, it's the same kind of thing. The lion stands for something. The man stands for something. And you just have to think about it long enough to figure out what it means. So he says, if we read it through this lens of oneness and connection and non-duality, then what makes sense is that we should kind of read it like this, that the lion is a metaphor for sort of the ego, the false self. And the man is the true self, the real person inside. And if you read it that way, it really makes a lot more sense. Blessed is the ego that becomes the true self when consumed by the Christ, and cursed is the true self whom the false ego consumes. So, okay, that makes a lot more sense. But even then, I wasn't 100% convinced. I'm like, again, okay, you could just decide that. And then he said, well, what's interesting is that Plato in his Republic used those exact same metaphors. Again, he's like 400 years before Jesus. And he, in his Republic, used the same kind of metaphor, that the lion is a metaphor for the ego, the false self, and the man is a metaphor for the true self, right? And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And then he says, the find at Nag Hammadi, they were all kind of bundled together. And in the bundle that included the Gospel of Thomas was a fragment of Plato's Republic. Guess which page it was? It's the page of the Republic where Plato explains the lion and the man. And that was it for me. I was like, dude, that's a smoking gun right there. Whoever put this stuff together and put it in the jar and sealed it at Nag Hammadi and buried it in the sand was trying to say, hey, if you have trouble understanding the Gospel of Thomas, I'm going to just put this right here and you're going to get it, right? You're going to be able to make sense of it. That blew my mind. I was like, okay, I'm convinced. I think maybe this is the right way to read the Gospel of Thomas. And again, as I read through it, now I got excited. Now I was like, okay, this I can decode this now, right? And that's my subtitle, Decoding the Lost Gospel of Thomas. It does decode for me. And now I'm like, okay, I think I understand what Jesus is trying to say. And it went from being something that I thought was ridiculous and nonsensical to something I thought was deep and profound, meaningful. And yeah, that's when I kind of fell in love with Thomas.
So, I mean, for me, another question would come up, is another reason why it's so hard sometimes to understand what the Gospel of Thomas is getting to, because there is no narrative.
Right.
Right. So is that part of the problem as well? I mean, so like with the Gospels, you have this narrative, you have context, you have the stories build around this context, whereas the Gospel of Thomas doesn't. Is that, would you consider that another like stumbling block?
I think that is a huge, huge point. I really do, John. I think because there's something really interesting that happened. So like, as I was going through it, as I was writing this book, and I basically just took like one saying at a time, and I tried to read it on my own. I didn't read commentaries. I didn't read other people's stuff. I just wanted to read it and try to make sense of it for myself. And once I kind of wrote out what I thought I was getting out of it, only then would I go and check, like, okay, what did Elaine Pagel say? What did Dominic Crossan say? What did Marcus Borg say? Like, on these kind of things. And sometimes I was like, oh, good. They validate what I said. I'm on the right page. Sometimes I was like, oh, cool. I think I found something they didn't find or whatever. But as I was doing that process and I came across the sayings, especially the sayings that are already repeated in, the other Gospels, the New Testament Gospels. Those especially, because without the context, when all I had was Jesus said, ... and I'm able to just look at the saying and evaluate it on its own weight, right? Again, but reading it through this lens of oneness and connection, I was like, I could see so much more meaning to it. And I started to feel like, and this is just my opinion, but what I feel like is that, if let's say Matthew and Luke are writing their Gospels and they're using a Q document like this, which is a collection of the sayings of Jesus, it started to feel like what was happening was they had a collection of the sayings of Jesus, divorced from narrative. It's just Jesus said these things that his disciples thought were significant and important enough to write down. Meaningful things. Meaningful on their own without this narrative context. And it felt like that these gospel writers in Matthew and Luke, and possibly Mark as well, are just sort of like, I'm telling a story, blah, 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 blah. Hey, I need Jesus to say something here. I'm just going to go over to this quotation thing and go, oh, that looks good. And I'm going to plop it in. It felt like that. It felt like this doesn't belong here. Like you're adding a context to it now that because you have Jesus saying it in this place at this time to these people right after this other thing just happened, well, then you are kind of forced now to read into it some meaning that you would never read into it if you just had the saying by itself. And so, again, if that's the way these Gospels were written, where they had next to them a collection of the sayings of Jesus, divorced from narrative and context, and then they stuck it in a narrative and context later, that changes the meaning of it. And so I think that is part of what I guess I'd say I appreciated about being able to come to the Gospel of Thomas and read these sayings. Again, even the ones I was very familiar with, it was kind of like reading them for the first time. Because now I wasn't looking to see, must be about the second coming, or this must be about the judgment on Jerusalem, or this must be about, the Pharisees and what jerks they are or something, right? Because none of that was surrounding it. It was just that quote. And I felt like there was way more meaning that was to discover, by doing it that way.
Yeah, it's almost like you can come at it with a greater sense of imagination, like kind of wondering, well, what would be the context of the thing that he said here? And then allowing the words just to hold the weight they are. They reminded me a lot of the Proverbs, actually. Sometimes I read through the Proverbs and I'm like, it's good wisdom. I just don't really know what the context is. But then I can allow it to take root in my life with almost a prophetic imagination within that, allowing those words to make more sense for me.
Yeah.
Something that you wrote about, which it just really impacted me, about this hiddenness and uncovering and the secretness, or whatever it is that the words that you used there, wasn't so much. And I know you talked about like how sometimes it's a layer and a layer and a layer and a layer, and you can never get down to the bottom of it. But something that I saw that you were reading was that it's all, or that you wrote about, was that it's like what is hidden can be revealed. It's like it's always been there. The kingdom of God is within you, that sort of language. And you use that example of having you have a liver in you, and you won't know that it's in you until you have like an x-ray, or that it's revealed to you that you have this liver inside of you. I felt like that was such an important observation about knowing that we get to use these sorts of extra biblical narratives, or texts, for a greater understanding of what has already existed from the beginning of time, and whatever time is. It's just this constant unveiling. I really appreciated all of that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you for saying that. And because I felt the need, I thought it was important to talk about that, because again, as we were saying earlier, the kind of pejoratives about the Gospel of Thomas is, it's Gnostic and it's all about the secret hidden wisdom of blah, blah, blah. But when I'm reading Thomas, I don't get that at all. I get that Jesus is desperately trying to reveal it. He wants his disciples to get it. And it's something that isn't obvious to them at first, until he shows them, right? And until he says to them, like, imagine this, think about this, consider this. And he's constantly trying to approach it from all these different angles to help them see something that is right there. It is in front of us. Like you said, the kingdom of God is within you, right? But if someone doesn't point that out to you, you don't know it. But once you know it, you get it. And one of the things too, that I love, like we're talking about, like, discovering sort of new meanings and contexts in the sayings of Jesus. And one of the ones that really came alive to me in a totally different way was the one where Jesus says, you know, if the blind lead the blind, they both fall into a pit or into the ditch, right? And when you read it in the Gospels, it's placed in a certain context, and it can only mean this one thing. And the way I always, growing up, had understood that, you know, because it's in this sort of embedded context, that, when Jesus says, that, you know, if the blind lead the blind, they both fall into a pit, it's the implied meaning in the Gospels in the New Testament is, so then make sure that you have a really good, wise, you know, leader who can, a guru or something, right, who can guide you, and all that stuff, who isn't blind. But when I was reading it in Thomas, and again, it's divorced from all that context, and it's just Jesus saying, if the blind lead the blind, they both fall into a pit. And if you're reading it through this lens of recognizing our connection with God and our connection with one another, suddenly it was like, oh my gosh. And it made so much sense to me. It was like, I think what Jesus really means to say is, only blind people need a guide. Like, if you can see, you don't need a guide. You don't have to worry about falling into the ditch, right? It is about, and Jesus does this a lot in Thomas. He even says once in Thomas, Thomas himself calls him master, and Jesus corrects him and says, I'm not your master. Because his whole goal is like, no, you need to see these things. You need to understand these things. I'm here to help you see those things. But once you see those things, you don't need me now, because you can see, you understand, you have this awareness yourself. And a truly good teacher doesn't create this dependency where the person is constantly dependent upon you, right? This is, by the way, one of my gripes about sort of modern evangelical Christianity is that, you know, our churches have become a school that no one ever graduates from, right? And our pastors and our teachers, our Bible teachers, are people who will just teach you from kindergarten to, 95 years old, and they'll never tap you on the shoulder and say, I think you got it. Yeah, I think you get it now. And I think you can handle this now. Go ahead. You can take this and go with it. And Jesus seems to that seems to be something he's emphatic about. Like, he wants his disciples to have understanding on their own, to internalize their oneness and their connection with God, their ability to have these revelations and recognitions of sort of connection with God. And then once they have that, there you go. You can see, you can walk on your own now.
Yeah. I love that sense of like waking up to what is already in place and has always existed. And you wrote about the idea of a metanoia, and it's almost like, instead of it being this repentance or like this sort of way of, like, woe is me, or I'm just a worm sort of mentality that is often projected in evangelical circles with repentance. It's like it's an awakening almost, yes. like a new way of seeing the world that you get to then partake in and participate in.
Yeah.
I really appreciated that. Yeah.
No, yeah. That's all through again. And that's what's exciting to me. And if anyone reading the book, you'll notice, like, I do a lot. I'm intentionally connecting the cool things that I'm discovering in Thomas with other things Jesus says, right, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, because when you do connect them, right, Jesus all the time is talking about metanoia, and I've always understood metanoia to be this idea of, like, it's not about being sorry for your sins, it's about change your mind, change your way of thinking, and again, that idea of metanoia, changing your mind, changing your perspective, seeing with new eyes, is all through Thomas. So when you connect that idea of metanoia that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount with the kind of constant metanoia that he talks about in Thomas, it connects beautifully. And that also is one of the things that excited me about it, was being able to kind of connect those dots. And hopefully people reading the book all feel the same way. Like, wow, that's really cool. Look how this connects with this.
Well, metanoia is, whenever I think of it, I think it is a waking up, but we're so discipled by the culture we live in that it's hard to live into the truths that we know are in existence. And you write about being troubled by truth, and the sense of it can be really difficult it's like a slow awakening sometimes. Even though you are waking up, there's still sleep in your eyes. There's a lot of rubbing that has to happen. And and it can give you a headache because it's too bright out or whatever it is. And so it's like, what does grace look like, I guess, in those sorts of spaces? Or even, I was even curious about like, what does it mean for you to feel troubled by truth? Have you been troubled by that in your own life or your own experiences?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. And Jesus totally says that in Thomas, right? That the truth will trouble you and before it changes you, right? And I think I appreciate that so much because I think, and you mentioned grace, right? I think hopefully what it does is that we recognize that it is a process. You know what I mean? I've always been frustrated, I think, because again, our culture kind of programs us and expectations this way. Like, I wish that spiritual transformation was like a light switch, right? Flick, it's on and it just stays on and there you go. We did it. It was a one-time thing, but it isn't, right? It's a constant, you can turn that on, you can turn the switch on, but it'll go out again. You'll have to go back and turn it on again, right? And you see this all through Thomas as well, where Jesus teaches something, but then it's like the disciples, they ask a silly question. He's like, you can almost feel his exasperation sometimes. Like, dude, I just explained this to you like 5 sayings ago, and here we are again. But he'll try another angle and try it again. But we're the same way, right? The disciples are stand-ins for us who, even when we think we get it, right? In the moment, we can be like, oh my gosh, we have this epiphany. Oh man, that was so great. Wow, this is life-changing stuff. This is amazing. And then 10 minutes later, you're in your car, someone cuts you off, like, screw that guy. Like, so, you know what I mean? We get it and we lose it, and we get it and we lose it. And we need these, I think that's why we need like spiritual disciplines. That's why we need, sort of daily spiritual practices that we employ to remind us. We need these reminders. I think that's why there's 114 sayings in Thomas. We need, these constant reminders of these things because it is easy to lose it. It's easy to fall back into sort of, as Jesus would say, maybe in the Thomas, like into that illusion, right? You can sort of have that fall back asleep. You woke up, you stood up, right? You got it, but then you go back to sleep. And so we need these constant awakenings. And it seems that that's also something that I think the early church understood as well. A long time ago, I came across some early church fathers who used this phrase, conversatio morum. I think it's in Latin, conversatio morum. And it can mean 2 things. You can translate it as death to the status quo, which of course is, I love that idea. But the other way to translate it is this idea of constant conversion. And I really appreciate it because it's whose status quo are we declaring death to? Mine, right? Because I have a status quo and I fall back into that status quo. And so this sort of constant mantra of conversatio morum, death to the status quo, constant conversion, to live in this constant conversion that we always need. In my old days, I would say every day I need to wake up and walk the aisle and bend the knee and give my life to Christ, right? It's not a one-time thing. It's a constant thing. It's a daily thing. We need to have this daily conversion, this daily surrender, this daily awakening. It's a constant thing. And that's part of whatever you want to call it, sanctification, spiritual disciplines, spiritual growth, transformation. It's not a one and done. I wish it was. It'd be so much easier if it was a one and done. But it feels like it's always, we get it, 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Yeah, it reminds, honestly, that's the way I view deconstruction.
Yeah.
Is I'm constantly deconstructing. And then I'm also, on some level, constantly on guard against becoming complacent against my own status quo and go, okay, well, am I questioning even the things that I now hold to be true? Because I don't think that process, I don't think it can ever end. I don't think it should ever end. I think the danger is in landing someplace where we go, okay, now I can, now I
got it. I've got it figured out.
Yeah. And that's John and I have talked about this a bunch, with different people over the years who we've either paid attention to or listened to or followed, who like they take something and they deconstruct it to a point, and then they go, all right, now this is a good landing spot. And we're like, yeah, you didn't go far enough.
Right.
Like, okay, fine. Like you got away from, maybe a legalistic God, but your God's still an asshole. Right. Like maybe he's not legalistic, but he's still going to throw a bunch of people in hell. or he still had to have some sort of violent atonement. And so I go to the next guy. Well, let's deconstruct that further. Let's get away from all the sacrificial language and all the violent, all the sacred violence. And then you still, there's always a place where you're in danger of resting and going, but there's still these remnants of pieces, I think, that are still incongruent with at least what resonates with me about the person of Jesus and the reality of God the Father. So I'm with that. I wonder, here's my question, and unrelated completely. So first part diatribe, second part question. Is the conspiracy theorist in me wonders, was there a time when this Gospel of Thomas was maybe well circulated and well read, and then either oppressed or suppressed by, the powers that be? Like it doesn't come up in the Council of Nicaea. So, or is it just lost?
Great question. Yeah, and I try to cover this in the book. And again, I have to tip the hat to people who are much smarter than me that study this for much longer than me. But like Elaine Pagels has a great book called Beyond Belief, which blew my mind. I had studied all kinds of early church stuff on my own before that, typically only looking at what early church fathers said about things like nonviolence, or things like, how they gathered together in the early church, and how they came together as the ecclesia and all that stuff. So I had studied a lot of that, but I also had a lot of assumptions about those guys and what they were like and who they were and what they valued and blah, blah, blah. And Elaine Pagel's book, Beyond Belief, was a book that just blew my mind about a lot of these things where, and so in her book, she talks about these early Christianities, plural, right? Bart Ehrman talks about this too. It's this misnomer that there was just always one Orthodox Christian group of people and maybe a few fringy here and there, a couple of weirdos on the side. But, mainly it was the true Christians, the true believers. And that's not the case. What we know now from church history and things like this is that there were a variety of so many different kinds of groups. They all would have called themselves Christians. They all would have said, we're following Jesus. They all would have used, the Gospels and even the writings of Paul and said, we are following Jesus. We're Christians. But they had wildly divergent views on all kinds of things, on God, on the Spirit, on angels, on demons, on salvation, on all kinds of things. And so there was a group of people that were they're called Valentinians. There was a guy named Valentinus. Valentinus was a disciple of a guy named Theodos, and Theodos was a disciple of the Apostle Paul. And we know that from people that didn't like Valentinus. That's what they told us about him. And he and his followers were much more on the page of what we see in Thomas. They preferred the Gospel of Thomas. A lot of scholars think that Valentinus wrote the Gospel of Truth, which was also discovered at Nag Hammadi, and it's a great text. And so people like Irenaeus, with like late first century, something like that. I think that was late first century, early second century. He really disliked Valentinus and the followers of Valentinus, and they preferred this text. And so what we think is that it's not so much that they didn't like the Gospel of Thomas per se, because again, it's no narrative story. It's just a collection of the sayings of Jesus. Half of them are already in the text that you like. So what are you upset about? But mostly what they were upset about was that they didn't like the Valentinian Christians, and they thought by discrediting the Gospel of Thomas, they could discredit them as well. And it feels like that. So the Gospel, to answer your question, the Gospel of Thomas did exist. It was in circulation. It was being read. It was being quoted. People who were telling other Christians not to read it, but were also quoting it. And usually were quoting it in a positive way, like Clement of Alexandria and also Irenaeus and other church fathers. So they were reading it. They had access to it. The big clue that we have, and this is at the point where the Gospel of Thomas got suppressed. And because this tension between these factions, so the followers of Irenaeus, who eventually become the Orthodox, we'll call them the proto-Orthodox Christians prior to Constantine. So around the time of Constantine, that stream of Christian, which eventually become Orthodox Christians, Athanasius is kind of one of the main guys in that group of Christians. But there's still Valentinian Christians around. and who also, again, are reading the Gospel of Thomas and some other texts like that. So after the Council of Nicaea, now with the authority of Rome behind them, because now they're favored by Constantine and the Roman Empire, and many of them are on the payroll and things like that, which is kind of problematic, Athanasius writes a letter. It's called the Easter Letter. And he writes a letter to all these churches and seminaries and monasteries. And the letter basically says, you are no longer allowed to continue using this list of texts in your worship services, in your sermons, in your homilies, in your worship gatherings and things like that. Which means up to that point, they were using those texts and they had to be told to stop. And the Gospel of Thomas is one of those texts. And this is one we think is what happened was after that letter went out, most of those monasteries, seminaries, churches, pastors, leaders burned and destroyed all of those texts. Thankfully, at least one guy in around Nag Hammadi, Egypt, instead of burning them and destroying them, but bound them up together, stuck them in this giant jar, sealed the jar, carried it out to the desert and buried it. And so it was buried from around like 340 AD. And it sat there as this incredible time capsule until like 1945 when it got discovered. And thankfully, someone decided to save them, or we wouldn't have these texts. We wouldn't even know they existed.
Again, the conspiracy theorist to me is always wondering, like, okay, what are they what are they keeping from us? Because besides the Gospel of Thomas, there's other non-canonical so-called gospels, right? And there's the Gospel of Judas.
Lots of them. Philip, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of the Truth,
there's the Gospel of Mary,
of John, the Gospel of Mary. Yeah, there's all kinds of texts. And you kind of need to take them each one at a time. You know what I mean? They all kind of need to be evaluated on their own. You know me, I'm not someone who feels like, I don't even think the canon is a good idea. We should have never canonized anything. Because prior to that, all these different people, whether they were proto-Orthodox, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Athanasius, or Valentinus, or other followers, they all had their own sort of preference of texts, right? So some of them would say, I love Matthew, and I love John, and I love Philippians, and I love the Gospel of the Shepherd of Hermas, and I love the Didache, and I love, whatever, the Book of Enoch or whatever. And so they would say, these to me are inspiring texts, and others are not. And that's okay. It was fine. Like every individual follower of Christ could say, these texts to me are inspirational, and others don't speak to me. And there was nothing wrong with that. For hundreds of years, nobody cared about that. There was no argument. No one's like, no, we have to agree. It wasn't until under Constantine, all of a sudden, it's like, okay, we gotta all agree on this. And if you don't agree, we're going to burn you alive or skin you alive or something. It's like, what? What?
As Jesus would do.
Just like Jesus would do. That's right. Agree with me.
Who would Jesus burn at the stake?
Who would Jesus torture? Yes.
Yeah.
We're not agreeing with you on theology. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's based so much on control and fear and trying to make sure that the narrative is tightly held in a box that we can use to define things and keep people in place. And it's, I mean, what you wrote about, this whole like oneness that God is inviting us into experiencing and understanding to wake up to, that allows for all sorts of different divergent ideas out there that are outside of our canon. And that also makes things a little bit messy, and messy doesn't work in regular church buildings.
That's right.
No,
that's
we don't like messy. No.
Right. Well, but this is what, again, and I'm not advocating for like, any sort of a canon or like, don't believe anything because I said so or anything like that. I'm just saying, like, I personally, I got a ton out of the Gospel of Thomas. I felt there was so much truth and wisdom in the book. And so that's why I wrote this book about it, to kind of share the things that I was noticing, the things that I think are profound and powerful and interesting and relevant. And the main thing for me that really excites me is that I felt like this message, this idea that Jesus gives us in the Gospel of Thomas, that we are all one with God. We are all inseparably connected to God. And because every single human being is inseparably connected to the divine, we're all connected to one another. And these are not new ideas. These are not non-biblical ideas. Jesus says these kinds of things. Paul says these kind of things, and we see these things in Colossians and Ephesians. We see it in the Gospel of John. So again, these are not new ideas. It's so emphasized in the Gospel of Thomas. And it's sort of like, hey, if we could get this, if we as a humanity could really understand and internalize this idea that we are all connected to the divine and we're all connected to one another, it's like this is the way we can, do the things that Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus says, whatever you've done to the least of these, you've done it unto me. Well, I can live my life that way if when I see another person, I don't see another person. I see Christ. I see even myself in that person. I see the divine in that person. The idea of like, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, when I look at my neighbor, if I don't see another person, I see myself. So that I can do that. So it's sort of the idea that I feel like if it clicks and it sort of makes everything else fall into place. This is how I love my enemies, because they're not my enemies. There's Christ is in that person and I'm in that person. I'm connected to that person. And again, I called it the quantum sayings of Jesus because these are kind of the things that we see as we look at quantum science as well. Quantum physics and quantum science is suggesting that there's just a quantum field. Like, everything you see around you, we see and experience everything in our senses as everything is separate. But the reality is everything is an expression of the quantum field. There's just the quantum field. And it looks like there's all these separate things, but at the quantum level, we're all the one thing. We're all this one connected thing, this quantum field. And however we get there, however we arrive at the realization that we as a human race are connected to one another and are connected to the divine, I don't really care how we get there. If Thomas helps you do that, great. If quantum science helps you do that, great. If it's Rumi or Black Elk or I don't care, you know what I mean? Whatever it takes for you to get that, the end result of it, the fruit of it is that we are able now to truly love one another and care for one another and recognize there is no other. There's just us.
That's so good. I've always heard that all truth is God's truth, which really resonates deeply with me. However, if the truth doesn't come from the good enough sources or like the ones that are put in place, like the ones that we've already agreed upon,
the
approved sources, then maybe that truth is a little sketchy. But I love what you've written here with the Gospel of Thomas. It just expands my whole understanding of God's truth being so much vaster and bigger and better than I could have ever imagined.
Well, what's interesting is if you read even people like Richard Rohr, who this is exactly in line with what Richard Rohr has been talking about for 20, 30 years, right? This non-duality, this universal Christ, this notion of, it falls right in line with a C. Baxter Kruger, who will say, like, we use his quote at the beginning of our podcast, that this is the lie that Christianity has been selling for 2,000 years, that we have separated, that we're separate from God, and that oneness with God is something to be attained or achieved, rather than something to be awakened to.
Thank you. That's right. See, this is the part of it too. This is the other part of it. It's like, even if Christianity does teach this, the dangerous thing and the sad thing is that they teach that this oneness with God and this oneness with Christ is something you have to jump to these hoops for first. And it's something that if you have to keep doing it, so come back next Sunday and do it again, or you might lose it, you might forget it, or we're gonna make sure, and that's the part of it. That's the part I really don't like. And what excites me is like what Baxter Kruger says. I love Baxter, and I love Richard Rohr. Yeah, it's this idea that, and again, these are not new ideas. These are not non-Christian ideas. Paul is constantly talking about how we are the incarnation of Christ in the world today, right? Christ has no body now but yours. We are the incarnation of Christ. And so, again, Paul says all this, to these idol-worshiping pagans that, hey, this God you never even heard of, you don't even believe in it. You don't know about this God. This God is the one you live and move and have your being. This God is your Father, and He loves you and blesses you, hoping you'll turn to Him and recognize, wake up. Like, hey, yeah, I am connected to this God, and I can't escape this God, and this God loves me. And these ideas are not new ideas to Christianity. They just haven't been emphasized. And I love that Thomas is a complete emphasis of all those ideas, and I love that.
Well, there's something about reading even the sayings in Thomas that are echoed in the other Gospels, that reading them through that lens brings some newness to that, because we're just over familiar, aren't we? I mean, I've been I've been reading the Bible since I was old enough to read.
That's right.
And so, and I've had very few experiences. One was with Terry Wildman when we had him on talking about his First Nations translation of the Bible, where he just read some very familiar verses in a very unfamiliar way that had me just about borderline tears. And I haven't had that experience with scripture in a very long time. And I'm like, that's just a case of becoming so familiar that you can't be astounded by it anymore. And all of a sudden, Thomas can come along and go, oh, wait a minute.
You've never thought of it that way. You've never seen it this way.
Right.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, and they can take things like, we know that Paul says that nothing can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ. Death, and it just goes through his whole litany of things. And if it just becomes a memory verse,
that's right,
that we recite, like, okay, that's okay, good. And then it can sometimes lose its profundity. It's like, oh my gosh, so he means nothing.
Nothing.
Like there's literally nothing that could separate. So there is no division.
Not angels, not demons, not death.
Yeah. Not depth, nor height, not all right.
Nothing.
Like nothing. And so, but when that sort of realization dawns on you,
yeah,
then you understand not only the truth of the gospel, but you also begin to understand the lie of religion.
That's right. Yeah. The goodness of God and the love of God that is just way beyond better than you could ever have imagined. And yeah, and the lie of religion that wants to make it a lot smaller.
Yeah.
Right.
Or make it difficult or costly to attain.
Yes.
Let me either put a price tag on it or let me make an obstacle course out of it, both of which have me in a leadership role guiding you and leading you towards your truth, right? That's the nefarious nature of it all. So when I rail against religion, it's not just because, I buck against authority. No, it's just because the lie that's being told is, let me sell you what is already yours.
Yeah, that's right.
Or let me walk you through this minefield of things. All you have to do is wake the hell up.
That's right. Yeah, there's nothing you have to do to earn it. It's like that idea of, you guys know I talk about this all the time, like the sort of like worm theology stuff. Like when we are in that mindset of like, when you tell people like, nothing will separate you from the love of God, and God is love, and you are loved of God, and you're made in the image of God, and all that stuff. You can say all those things, and people really still don't get it, right? It's so hard to internalize it and to grasp it. It's like, and this idea of deserving, right? There's so many worship songs that I cannot sing because like they'll, even when they're trying to tell you about, the amazing love of God, it's like, but you don't deserve it.
You don't, even though I don't deserve it. Thank you, Lord.
And it pisses me off. And I'm just like, okay, wait a minute. First of all, God never talks about that. God never uses that language. God, especially if in the scriptures, if anything is talking about the love of God, and you can go to all these amazing scriptures about God's love, 1 Corinthians 13, and the one in Romans about nothing will separate us from the love of God, and all these amazing verses that God is love in 1 John. And none of them ever have an asterisk or a next verse that says, but you don't deserve it, you filthy piece of crap. But we put that in there, right? And it's like, look, it's like saying the sky is blue. Does it deserve to be blue? It's not about that. It's blue because it's the sky. You're loved because you are created in God's image. You are beloved because love created you in the image of love. It's not about deserving. It'll never be about that. And to put that in there, again, that's that nefarious part of it that's so destructive to this idea. It's the reason why people struggle so much to accept this idea that they are loved, right? And that they deserve it.
Everything in our world, it's not just the church that's really good at telling people that they suck, but everything in this world tells us that we have to work to deserve somebody's love and acceptance. And it doesn't come easy. So, as at my church, I feel like I preach the same sermon every Sunday with a different text. And I'm just like, maybe you get bored of hearing the same thing, that you're loved by God and you don't need to do anything to gain more of that love beyond just waking up and receiving it. And I said, but the reason I preach it week in and week out is because we just are so damn forgetful.
That's right.
And there's so many voices telling us otherwise throughout our week that sometimes you just need to show up and hear the same thing again, that you are beloved, full stop. And this one girl, she's a high schooler and she'd been coming to church for a couple of years, and she made me a bracelet that said beloved on it. And she said, you talk about this every Sunday, so I thought I'd put it on a bracelet. And I was like, either that is really embarrassing because I have nothing creative to say, or you're finally getting it. One or the other is a good thing.
What also helps in this too is if you have kids, right? If you have children, right? I would never, ever say to my sons, just go on and on about how much I love them and how much they mean to me and how proud I am of them and how they just make my life incredibly meaningful and purposeful. And I just would never, ever go on and on about love and then say, but you don't deserve it. You could never even, it wouldn't even enter your mind. And if I did tell them how much I love them and then they said, oh yeah, Dad, but I don't deserve it, I would like, what are you talking about? Who told you that, right? Because that's bullshit. That's not true. It's like you don't need to earn it. You don't have to deserve it. You just are loved.
Well, it's not even a question. I wrote about this in my book. It's like it's not even a question of whether you do or don't deserve it. It's that deserving never is even a part of the equation.
That's right.
Like, and anybody who has children or grandchildren or nephews or nieces or whatever, it doesn't have to be just parents, right? But the instant my first child was born, she was perfect. From that, I mean, there was never an issue of whether she would or would not ever earn that or deserve that. It was just given because I couldn't fucking help it. I couldn't do otherwise.
That's right. Yeah, same thing. When my son was born, my first son was born, I remember he was sleeping between us in the bed. I woke up one morning and my wife Wendy's asleep and my little son is sleeping, between us, just zonked out. And I just looked at him and I was so overwhelmed with love for him. And I thought, man, where is this coming from? Right? Like he can't do anything. He doesn't know my name. He can't say anything. He can't do anything. All he can do is eat and sleep and poop. And it doesn't matter to me. Like I would die for him. I would, and I was just overwhelmed with that kind of love. And it was just like this little, switch in my head. It was like, yeah, and that's how God loves you. And it's so true, right? It's so beautiful. And that's the epiphany. That's what we have to get. We have to understand that.
But it gets diluted with that language.
Yes.
Of deserving or, that whole, I've led worship for years and years and I've started discarding songs like that. But it was, those songs that were like, you love me even though I don't deserve it. Thank you, Jesus, that you love me even though I'm a worthless piece of shit. And it so missed the point. I mean, it wasn't even funny. John, I cut you off, man. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just thinking about one of the sayings. I think it's saying number 4 about the old man and the 7-day-old child.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly. I mean, and you can take that meaning and say, well, that doesn't mean anything. No one can get any kind of wisdom from a 7-day-old child.
Right.
But I think what you just said proves you can get wisdom from a 7-day-old child.
That's right. That's exactly right. No, that's exactly right. That's the beautiful thing. I love that. That's one of my favorite sayings in Thomas. Like a man old in years can ask a child 7 days old about the meaning of life and receive an answer. And yeah, that's exactly right.
No, it's beautiful. I so appreciate. I appreciate what you've done here. I wonder if you're embarking on a new series. So we'll.
I am actually. Yes, I am.
Let's talk about. Or would it be other non-canonical gospels or other heretical sayings?
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, the way I wrote this book was I started this weekly thing where every Friday, it was called The Inner Circle, and every Friday I would publish an article, a blog post, where I would cover one of the sayings of Thomas. And so after doing that for a little over a year and a half, it was like, hey, I got enough for a book. I'll collect it together, write an introduction, conclusion, write a book. And so I've completed that, obviously. And the series is still going, but I think it wraps up in a couple of weeks. So I have already started doing writing a commentary. So it'll be a same thing every Friday. I'm going to just continue doing it. And it'll be a commentary every week, every Friday on the gospel of truth.
Oh, great. That'd be great.
Yeah. It's really good.
More to come is what you're saying.
Of course. And yes, you know me.
More.
I'm writing.
I do. I don't know how you find time to do anything else but write.
I do a lot of other things, but sometimes I have to get up early in the morning where everyone else is asleep or stay up late. But yeah,
you are simultaneously an inspiration and a thorn in the side of all of us who are like, shit, I can't write as prolifically as Keith. But I tell you what, if so, we've gotten this far.
If you haven't already done so, you probably should have stopped 30 minutes ago and just gone and ordered this book. If you've made it this far and haven't ordered the book, you probably should. I've read all your books, Keith, and I'm like one of your biggest fans, dude.
Oh, thank you.
And I think this is by far your most impactful.
Thank you.
I mean, and I just don't know. I don't know why it just resonates with me, and maybe it's just because it is so different. But maybe because so much of what I've read from you before, I'm like, oh yeah. You know what I mean? You're just saying stuff I'm thinking, and this was all fairly new. I'm like, oh, okay. Anyway, I applaud you for doing it. You're an inspiration to us all.
Thank you.
That came out corny, didn't it? You're an inspiration to us. I felt like I was giving you
inspiration to us all. Thank you so
you're
much.
An inspiration to every one of us who, but no, seriously, this book is phenomenal. And,
Thank you.
And I just hope it continues to just defy all your expectations, and lead you on to greater and greater things, man.
Thank you. Appreciate it so much. Yeah. And I'm very happy with how it's gone, and I've gotten a lot of great feedback from people. I think the thing that I'm excited about the most is that this book, it definitely appeals to people who have gone through deconstruction and kind of like where we're at in our sort of spiritual journeys. But I've really made an intention to kind of like color outside my sort of evangelical, progressive, deconstruction kind of spaces, those circles. And I've done some interviews with some podcasts and some people that are, kind of more new age or more not really in the Christian circles and stuff. And they've resonated as well, which I find really exciting. So I'm hoping that because of that, this book will kind of reach people that beyond simply people that are kind of raised in the kind of Christian ghetto and all that kind of stuff, and people that are just interested in Jesus, but without all that kind of religious baggage. So I'm excited about that, and I'm very, very pleased with how well the book has done so far.
It's cool. You're sure to piss off a lot of people.
Oh, yeah.
I think it may not be your goal, but is always an interesting and fun little side effect.
Yeah.
So,
well, they already think I'm a heretic anyway, right? So what the heck? Let's just go in and point about it.
You might as well embrace it fully and just go, never set line from Tropic Thunder where never go full blown heretic.
Yes, I've done it. I've gone full blown heretic.
So, anyway, John, Bethany, any parting shots for KG here?
No, just once again, thank you for taking the time and coming and talking with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.